Hello, my friends. Tonight, we set sail into a scenario where a turning point that fundamentally changed the course of modern world history never happened. What if the October Revolution of 1917 never took place? What if the provisional government, formed after the collapse of the Russian Empire amidst the turmoil of World War I, had managed to halt the Bolsheviks' march to power? I am Mikhail, a young writer from Petrograd. I lived through those days and will tell you about a Russia that embarked on a more difficult journey instead of a revolution. Are you ready? Then get comfortable, because this journey will be much more surprising and thought-provoking than you imagine. Don't forget to like and share your own what-if scenarios. In this alternate timeline where the October Revolution failed, the Bolsheviks' attempt to seize power in Petrograd on the night of October 25, 1917, was suppressed by the loyal forces of the provisional government. Although the Red Guards, initially led by Lenin and Trotsky, managed to capture some strategic points, they failed to secure the support of the army and the majority of the populace. The swift intervention of Cossack regiments and some frontline troops, newly arrived in the cities, broke the Bolsheviks' pressure on the Petrograd Soviet, even leading to the arrest of several key Bolshevik leaders. I, as a writer caught in the chaos, was a personal witness to the revolution's last breath. The suppression of the Bolshevik uprising provided a provisional government with an opportunity to breathe and consolidate its authority. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky used this success to restore discipline in the army and increase his influence over the populace. However, this did not mean that all of Russia's problems were solved. The exhaustion from World War I, land demands in rural areas, and food shortages in cities still persisted. The Kerensky government had to find lasting solutions to these fundamental issues, a process that would require great political skill and diplomacy in an environment where the revolutionary spirit had not completely died out. I wrote in my notebook during those days that the people were still looking for a glimmer of hope. The failure of the October Revolution prevented the bloody course of the Russian Civil War as we know it. The devastating conflicts between the White Army and the Red Army would never have reached such proportions in this scenario. However, this would not mean complete peace in Russia. Even if the Bolsheviks had failed to seize power, they still had a strong base of support in rural and urban areas. Small-scale uprisings, acts of sabotage, and political assassinations could continue in different parts of the country. I, as a writer who felt this tension, poured the unease in the soul of the people into my poems and writings. Russia had turned back from the brink of a great civil war, but its wounds were still bleeding. Russia's situation in World War I would also have been different with the failure of the October Revolution, since there was no power like the Bolsheviks calling for an immediate withdrawal from the war. Russia would continue to fight on the side of the Allied powers. However, the exhaustion and low morale in the army could not be ignored. The Kerensky government had to offer better conditions to the soldiers at the front and redefine the meaning of the war. This was a very delicate diplomatic balancing act that required the government to manage both its internal opposition and its external allies. During this period, Russia was further strengthening its relations with the West and positioning itself as a part of Europe. The absence of the Bolsheviks had completely changed the political spectrum in Russia. Far-left forces were marginalized, and political debates were concentrated among liberal and moderate socialist parties. The government had immediately begun agricultural reforms, distributing a large portion of the land to the peasants. Because this fulfilled the Bolsheviks' biggest promise, it had significantly reduced the unrest in the rural areas. I was observing the joy and hope that these reforms created among the peasants and taking notes. This new policy was one of the most important steps that would shape the future of Russia. Russia's failure to withdraw from World War I disrupted Germany's war plans. Germany, forced to continue fighting on two fronts, divided its forces on the Western Front. This situation caused the Allies to win the war earlier and forced Germany into a peace with heavier terms. Russia took its place as one of the victorious nations of the war, and this strengthened its position in the international arena. I was writing about the enthusiasm and pride that this victory created on the streets of Petrograd. The Russian people had finally won a victory after their exhaustion. In the post-war period, Russia received great economic aid from the West. This aid accelerated Russia's industrialization and facilitated its transition to a modern economy. Agricultural reforms and industrial investments raised the country's level of prosperity. I was astonished to see that Russia, which had once struggled with poverty, now had modern factories and a flourishing economy. This was a victory won against the dark alternative of the October Revolution. Russia would have either turned into a constitutional monarchy or a parliamentary republic. There were debates about whether the Tsar's family, especially the Romanovs, would continue to hold political power or be sent into exile. As a writer, I was closely following these political debates. The majority of the people and intellectuals were advocating for a Western-style democracy. The failure of the October Revolution led to the exile or arrest of leaders like Lenin and Trotsky. The communist ideology remained a marginal thought in Russia and never became a global power. I was trying to express the potential danger that this ideology posed in my writings and poems. After emerging victorious from World War I, Russia took its place as a power in the international arena. The Allies did not see Russia as a communist threat, but accepted it as a part of the West. This allowed the political map and alliances of Europe to be shaped completely differently. Literature, art, and culture in Russia developed free from the restrictions that the revolution would have brought. Artists could freely address the problems of society and present new movements and ideas. As a writer, I was enjoying this atmosphere of freedom. In this alternate history, Russia's industrialization took place under the leadership of the private sector, not under state control. This led to a more competitive economy and a faster technological development. Russia became one of the world's greatest industrial powers. Since Russia was not a communist power that opened the largest front against the Nazis in World War II, Germany's war plans changed completely. Hitler's armies failed to realize their dreams of expansion eastward. This profoundly affected the course and outcome of the war. The non-existence of the Soviet Union prevented the bipolar structure of the Cold War. The world was governed more in a multipolar balance of power rather than an ideological war between the USA and Russia. This increased the importance of international diplomacy. Russia's technological development accelerated, thanks to its strong relations with the West. Thanks to joint projects with American, British, and French engineers, Russia also became an important power in space technology. Russian literature experienced a golden age as it was free from the oppression of the revolution. The heirs of writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky could freely address the problems of society and create new philosophical and artistic movements. Russia preserved its traditional Orthodox faith. Since the Church was free from the oppression of the revolution, it continued to play a strong role in society. This allowed for the preservation of Russia's cultural identity. In this alternate history where Russia was not the Soviet Union, Eastern European countries also had a different fate. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, not falling under a communist regime, established closer relations with Western Europe. In this new era, Russia adopted Western values like equality and freedom. However, it combined these with its own traditions and history to create a unique political system. This system included both liberalism and the moderate aspects of socialism. In this alternate history where Russia was not a communist threat, the role of the United States in the world also changed. Since there was no Cold War, the US reduced its military spending and invested that money in social projects. This new Russia preserved its traditional artistic and cultural heritage. The socialist realism movement that the Bolsheviks would have brought never emerged. Art developed as an expression of freedom and creativity. In this alternate history, Russia collaborated with the West in the field of science and technology instead of competing with it. Thanks to joint projects, humanity landed on the moon earlier and space research progressed faster. Since Russia was not a communist threat, its relations with the United States also developed differently. The two countries established closer relations through joint projects and cultural exchanges. Since Russia did not have a communist ideology, political developments in China also took a different direction. It was more difficult for leaders like Mao Zedong to start a communist revolution. Since Russia was not a communist power that opened the largest front against the Nazis in World War II, Germany's war plans changed completely. Hitler's armies failed to realize their dreams of expansion eastward. This profoundly affected the course and outcome of the war. The non-existence of the Soviet Union prevented the bipolar structure of the Cold War. The world was governed more in a multipolar balance of power rather than an ideological war between the USA and Russia. This increased the importance of international diplomacy. Russia's technological development accelerated, thanks to its strong relations with the West. Thanks to joint projects with American, British, and French engineers, Russia also became an important power in space technology. Since Russia was not a communist power that opened the largest front against the Nazis in World War II, Germany's war plans changed completely. Hitler's armies failed to realize their dreams of expansion eastward. This profoundly affected the course and outcome of the war. And so, friends, our journey into this imaginary world where the October Revolution never happened and history took a completely different path has come to an end. If you enjoyed our story, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. I wish a good night to everyone who stayed up late with me.